August 1944. Fort Lewis, Washington. Günter Gräwe, a 19-year-old German soldier captured in France, stood before the prisoner of war camp canteen, 5-cent pieces clutched in his palm, facing a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Before him, a freezer filled with ice cream. Beside it, a cooler stocked with bottles of Coca-Cola. Both cost a nickel. Both were luxuries he had not seen in years. The ice cream he had not tasted any since before the war began in Europe. The Coca-Cola he had never tasted the American soft drink in his entire life. He bought both. In that moment, standing in a prisoner of war camp thousands of miles from his homeland, Günter Gräwe realized something that Nazi propaganda had never prepared him for. He was a captured enemy soldier, yet he was eating better than he had during 4 years of service in the Wehrmacht. He was eating better than German officers ate. He was eating better than his own family back in Ludenscheid. I suddenly realized how extremely lucky I had been to be captured by the American army, he would write 70 years later, returning as a 91-year-old man to thank the United States for his treatment, and not the Russian one. This realization, repeated by hundreds of thousands of German prisoners across 511 camps throughout the United States between 1942 and 1946, would accomplish something no propaganda campaign could achieve. It would deliver an ideological blow to Nazi beliefs about American weakness and German superiority that no amount of Allied bombing or battlefield victories could match. It would be accomplished not through punishment, but through abundance, not through deprivation, but through ice cream sundaes, unlimited Coca-Cola, chocolate bars, and the casual waste of food that could have fed entire German villages for months. This is the extraordinary story of how America's material plenty transformed enemy soldiers into advocates for democratic values, one nickel ice cream cone at a time. The journey to this transformation began in North Africa, where the first mass surrenders of German forces provided America with its initial prisoner of war challenge. On May 13, 1943, after months of grinding warfare across the Tunisian desert, the remnants of General Feldmarschall Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps surrendered to Allied forces. Approximately 250,000 German and Italian soldiers laid down their weapons at ports like Bizerte, Tunis, and Oran in Algeria. These veteran troops, hardened by years of combat in the harsh North African environment, expected the treatment they had been warned about through Nazi propaganda. They anticipated starvation. They feared brutality. They believed American and British forces would exact revenge for years of warfare. Many expected they would not survive captivity. What they encountered instead began the cognitive dissonance that would only deepen during their time in American custody. At the North African ports, German prisoners received the same meals as American soldiers. For men who had survived on reduced rations in the African desert, who had experienced supply shortages and the gradual deterioration of Wehrmacht logistics, the quality and quantity of food seemed impossible. It was better than they had eaten in 4 years of military service. Better, in fact, than their own officers ate. Obergefreiter Werner Kritzinger, captured at Bizerte, recorded his impressions in a diary he kept throughout captivity. They gave us white bread, real white bread. Coffee with sugar and milk, not the ersatz coffee we drank in the Afrika Korps, but real American coffee. Eggs, bacon, fruit we had not seen in years. The American guards told us this was standard field rations. I did not believe them, but it was true. American military doctrine emphasized that well-fed troops performed better in combat. The same principle extended to prisoners of war, both because Geneva Convention protocols required it, and because American abundance made it practical. The United States could afford to feed its enemies generously, not as an act of charity, but as standard policy enabled by industrial and agricultural capacity that Nazi Germany could not match. The first meal many German prisoners ate in American custody delivered more calories than they had consumed in an average day during their final months in North Africa. The shock to their systems was, in some cases, literally nauseating. Men whose bodies had adapted to inadequate rations found themselves unable to digest rich American food. Some became ill. Others thought they were being poisoned, a final act of cruelty disguised as kindness. My stomach hurt for 3 days, remembered Feldwebel Hans Waker, captured in Tunisia. Not because the food was bad, but because it was too good. My body had forgotten what real meat tasted like. This initial experience with American abundance was only the beginning. The voyage across the Atlantic Ocean to the United States continued the education in material plenty that had begun in North Africa. German prisoners travelled aboard Liberty ships, mass-produced cargo vessels that exemplified American industrial capacity. These ships, built in shipyards across the United States at the rate of 3 per day at peak production, represented manufacturing capability that exceeded anything Germany had achieved. The 3-week journey across the Atlantic provided ample time for captured German soldiers to observe and contemplate what they were experiencing. They were fed regularly. The food remained plentiful. American guards, though vigilant, did not behave with the cruelty German propaganda had predicted. The organization, the logistics, the methodical processing, all of it surpassed anything the prisoners had experienced in Wehrmacht operations. Wehrmacht Corporal Friedrich Schumann kept detailed notes throughout the Atlantic crossing. The ship's galley served meals 3 times daily, always hot food, always enough. I counted the supply crates being loaded at Oran. There must have been food for 1,000 men for 2 months, and we were only 300 prisoners with 50 guards. When I asked an American sailor where they got so much food, he laughed and said this was normal, that America had so much they worried more about waste than shortage. The concept seemed incomprehensible to men raised in a nation where rationing had begun before the war and intensified with each passing year. Germany's food situation had deteriorated steadily since 1939. By 1943, German civilian rations provided barely adequate nutrition. Meat was scarce. Fresh fruit was rare. Butter, eggs, milk, all strictly rationed. German soldiers at the front received better rations than civilians, but supply difficulties meant even frontline troops experienced shortages. Yet here were captured German soldiers, enemies of the United States, being fed more generously than they had ever been fed in their own military service. The implications challenged every assumption about American weakness that Nazi ideology had promoted. When the ships docked at American ports, Norfolk, Virginia was a common destination. The prisoners encountered their first direct view of the American homeland. What they saw confounded their expectations even further. The ports bustled with activity. Ships loaded and unloaded continuously. Mountains of supplies, crates, barrels, vehicles, equipment crowded the docks. Cranes lifted cargo with mechanical efficiency. Trucks moved in organized convoys. Everything functioned with a methodical precision that suggested unlimited resources, backing unlimited industrial capacity. I had never seen anything like it, recalled Unteroffizier Klaus Becker, captured in Tunisia and transported to Norfolk. The propaganda told us America was weak, divided, unprepared for war. But standing on that dock, watching ship after ship being loaded with supplies heading to Europe, watching thousands of soldiers moving through organized chaos with perfect efficiency, I understood for the first time that we had lost the war. Germany could never match this. From the ports, the prisoners boarded passenger trains, not freight cars, not cattle cars, but actual passenger trains with seats and windows for transport to camps across the American interior. This detail alone stunned many prisoners. In Germany, even civilian passengers often crowded into inadequate rail cars. Freight transport for military purposes had priority, yet America was transporting enemy prisoners in comfortable passenger coaches. The train journeys across America provided views of farmland, cities, towns, and industrial centers that reinforced the lesson of overwhelming material abundance. German prisoners pressed against windows, watching the American landscape roll past, trying to reconcile what they saw with what they had been told. Fields stretched to the horizon, worked by modern agricultural equipment. Cities appeared prosperous, undamaged by bombing. Civilians wore new clothing. Automobiles filled roads, private automobiles, not just military vehicles. The prisoners were seeing a nation fully mobilized for war that showed no external signs of deprivation or sacrifice. By the time the trains delivered prisoners to camps across the American interior, the ideological foundations of Nazi propaganda about American weakness had already begun to crack. What happened inside the camps would complete the transformation. The United States established 511 prisoner-of-war camps across the country during World War II. These ranged from large base camps capable of holding several thousand prisoners to small branch camps housing a few dozen men assigned to agricultural or industrial work details. The camps were located primarily in the South, Southwest, Great Plains, and Midwest regions, with agricultural labor shortages and sufficient space to house large numbers of prisoners. The War Department had little precedent for managing such a massive influx of prisoners. America had not dealt with captured enemy soldiers on this scale since the Civil War. The Geneva Convention protocols of 1929 provided guidelines, but translating those protocols into practical policy required improvisation. The solution involved converting existing facilities, civilian conservation corps camps, high school gymnasiums, local fairgrounds, even racetracks into temporary prison facilities, while constructing purpose-built camps for long-term detention. What emerged was a system that, for all its improvisations and inefficiencies, provided German prisoners with living conditions that most found superior to their accommodations in Wehrmacht service. The typical prisoner-of-war camp consisted of barracks housing 50 men each, with communal mess halls, recreational facilities, canteens, and administrative buildings surrounded by barbed wire fences and guard towers. The guards were often older men, or those classified as unfit for combat duty. Security was maintained, but the atmosphere was generally relaxed compared to military bases or combat zones. Inside the camps, German prisoners encountered daily life that contradicted everything Nazi ideology had taught them about American society. The food remained the central revelation. Camp Clinton in Mississippi, which housed some of the highest-ranking German officers captured in North Africa, provided meals that exemplified the standard: breakfast of cereal, toast, cornflakes, jam, coffee, milk, and sugar; lunch of roast pork, potato salad, carrots, and ice water; supper of meatloaf, scrambled eggs, coffee, milk, and bread; beer available for purchase in the canteen. These were not meals designed to merely sustain life. These were meals that provided nutrition exceeding the daily caloric intake of average German civilians and matching or surpassing what German soldiers received at the front. The food was prepared by German cooks using ingredients furnished by the US Army, a detail that prevented claims that Americans were somehow adulterating the meals. The prisoners could not claim the food was unpalatable because their own countrymen prepared it using traditional recipes. The quantity of food available shocked prisoners accustomed to German rationing. There was no limit on bread. Coffee and milk were unlimited. Sugar, rationed strictly in Germany, was freely available. Meat appeared at every meal, not scraps, but real cuts of pork, beef, and chicken. Fresh vegetables accompanied meals throughout the year, even in winter when such items were impossible to obtain in wartime Germany. But the food, while important, was only one aspect of the material abundance that confronted prisoners. The camp canteens provided another lesson in American plenty. According to Geneva Convention protocols, prisoners of war who performed labor were entitled to compensation. The United States paid prisoners 80 cents per day for work details, a nominal sum, but one that provided spending money for purchases at camp canteens. Officers, who were not required to work under Geneva Convention rules, received pay scaled by rank, with lieutenants starting at 60 marks, monthly approximately $15, with deductions for food and housing. With this money, prisoners could purchase items at camp canteens that seemed to represent impossible luxury to men from a nation experiencing severe wartime shortages. Chocolate bars were universally available, not ersatz chocolate made with substitute ingredients, but real American chocolate from major manufacturers Hershey's, Nestlé, Mars, Milky Way, Snickers. These chocolate bars cost 10 cents. They were unlimited. Prisoners could buy as many as they wanted, as often as they wanted. Many prisoners, who had not tasted chocolate in years, whose children back in Germany had never tasted chocolate at all, found themselves buying multiple bars daily simply because they could. Coca-Cola, the distinctively American soft drink, was available for 5 cents per bottle. For many German prisoners, this was their first taste of carbonated beverages. The concept of paying a nickel for sweetened, fizzy water, seemed absurd, a waste of resources that could be better used elsewhere. Yet the Coca-Cola flowed endlessly, with bottles replaced as fast as prisoners could drink them. The Coca-Cola Company had established 64 bottling plants in wartime Europe and Asia to supply American troops, and the prisoners benefited from the same distribution network. Ice cream represented perhaps the most powerful symbol of American abundance. Ice cream required refrigeration, sugar, milk, and manufacturing capacity, all resources that Germany lacked or rationed severely. Yet American prison camps had ice cream available daily. Prisoners could buy ice cream sundaes for 5 or 10 cents. They could eat ice cream with every meal if they chose. The casual availability of ice cream, a luxury food that required significant resources to produce and maintain, demonstrated material plenty that exceeded anything prisoners had imagined possible. Günter Gräwe's moment of choice at Fort Lewis, deciding between ice cream and Coca-Cola, then buying both for 15 cents, encapsulated the cognitive dissonance thousands of prisoners experienced. He was a captured enemy soldier eating ice cream in quantities and with frequency that would have been impossible for a wealthy civilian in Germany. The last ice cream he had tasted in Germany was years before the war. Now, as a prisoner of his enemy, he could eat ice cream whenever he wanted. The ice cream overwhelmed everything else, recalled Ernst Müller, a prisoner at Camp Concordia in Kansas. We had chocolate, we had Coca-Cola, we had beer in the canteen, but the ice cream every day, as much as you wanted, that destroyed every claim our propaganda had made about American weakness. A nation fighting a two-front war around the world, and they could give ice cream to their prisoners? We had lost. We just didn't realize it yet. The abundance extended beyond food and luxuries. Prisoners received adequate clothing, American-made uniforms modified with painted stripes or patches to identify them as prisoners. They received toiletries, soap, toothpaste, razors, shaving cream in quantities that exceeded what many had available before capture. The barracks were heated in winter. Medical care was provided by American military doctors and nurses. German prisoners received health care that surpassed what many German civilians could access. One statistic reveals the impact of adequate nutrition and health care. German prisoners held in the United States gained an average of 25 pounds during their captivity. Men who had experienced the gradual nutritional deprivation of wartime military service, who had adapted to inadequate rations and limited medical care, found their bodies recovering and thriving on the abundance of American prison camps. 25 pounds of weight gain for prisoners of war, while their families in Germany experienced increasing hunger and deprivation. The irony was not lost on the prisoners themselves. The Geneva Convention protocols required that prisoners be allowed to send and receive correspondence with their families. The United States implemented this requirement, establishing mail systems that allowed prisoners to write letters home and receive packages from Germany. This correspondence system created a feedback loop that amplified the impact of American abundance. German prisoners wrote letters home describing their treatment. They described the food. They mentioned ice cream, chocolate, Coca-Cola. They explained they were gaining weight. They noted they were being treated fairly, even humanely. These letters, read by families experiencing increasing privation in Germany, created bewilderment and disbelief. How could captured German soldiers be eating better than German civilians? How could enemy prisoners have access to chocolate that German children had never tasted? How could America, supposedly struggling with the demands of global war, afford to give ice cream to its prisoners? The mail system also allowed prisoners to send packages back to Germany. The US Army permitted prisoners to purchase items at camp canteens and mail them to their families. German prisoners began sending chocolate bars, soap, coffee, and other goods that had become scarce or impossible to obtain in Germany. Think about the implications. Enemy soldiers, captured in combat, were sending care packages of American products to their families in Germany. The normal flow of wartime packages from home front to soldiers at the front had reversed. Prisoners were supporting their families with the abundance available in American camps. I bought 10 Hershey bars and mailed them to my mother and sister, remembered Hans Schmidt, a prisoner at Camp Shelby in Mississippi. My mother wrote back saying my little sister cried when she tasted chocolate for the first time. She was 8 years old. My little sister tasted her first chocolate because I was a prisoner of war in America. This made no sense, according to everything we had been taught. The cognitive dissonance intensified as the war progressed and conditions in Germany deteriorated. By 1944, Allied bombing campaigns had disrupted German production and distribution. Food shortages worsened, ration portions decreased. German civilians survived on approximately 1,200 calories per day, barely adequate to sustain life for sedentary individuals, inadequate for anyone performing physical labor. Meanwhile, their captured sons, brothers, and husbands in American prison camps were eating 3,800 calories per day. They were playing soccer and volleyball. They were attending concerts and theatrical performances organized by fellow prisoners. They were taking classes and earning wages and buying chocolate bars and ice cream. The disparity between conditions in Germany and conditions in American prison camps created a growing realization among prisoners that Nazi propaganda had systematically lied about American weakness and German superiority. If America was weak and decadent, how could it afford to feed its prisoners so generously? If Germany was strong and superior, why were German civilians starving while captured German soldiers thrived? The material abundance prisoners experienced extended beyond food and consumer goods. American prison camps provided recreational and educational opportunities that most prisoners had never experienced even before the war. Individual barracks fielded teams for athletic competitions. Sports equipment, soccer balls, volleyballs, horseshoes was provided by camp administrators. Tournaments were organized. Prisoners published camp newspapers reporting athletic results and other news. Some camps had soccer fields where competitive matches drew hundreds of spectators. The camps allowed prisoners to organize theatrical productions, musical performances, and cultural events. German prisoners created orchestras, drama societies, and art exhibitions. They performed plays and concerts for fellow prisoners. They painted, sculpted, and wrote. The camps provided materials, paper, paints, musical instruments that enabled cultural expression. Educational programs allowed prisoners to take courses in English, mathematics, vocational skills, and other subjects. Some camps established relationships with nearby colleges and universities, with professors coming to teach classes to prisoners. German prisoners could earn educational credentials while in captivity, credentials that would prove valuable when they returned to Germany after the war. Libraries stocked with books in German and English were established in major camps. Prisoners could borrow books freely. Some prisoners reported reading more during their captivity than they had in their entire previous lives. The access to information, to ideas, to uncensored literature provided intellectual stimulation that contrasted sharply with the controlled information environment of Nazi Germany. All of this, the sports, the cultural activities, the education, was provided by the United States to enemy prisoners of war. The implications challenged everything prisoners believed about American society. One prisoner, reflecting on his experience decades later, described it as living in a golden cage. Imprisoned, certainly, but imprisoned in conditions so comfortable, with opportunities so abundant, that captivity seemed preferable to the lives many had led before the war. "We were prisoners," acknowledged Werner Müller, who spent 3 years at various camps in Texas and Louisiana. "We could not leave. We were behind barbed wire with armed guards. But within those fences, we had food, shelter, medical care, entertainment, education, things my family in Hamburg no longer had, things many Germans had never had even before the war. The cage was golden because it revealed how poor our lives had been, even when we thought ourselves prosperous. Geneva Convention protocols prohibited using prisoners of war for work, directly related to the war effort. However, agricultural labor, construction, manufacturing of non-military goods, and similar work was permitted. The United States faced acute labor shortages as millions of American men entered military service. Farmers struggled to harvest crops, factories needed workers, infrastructure projects lacked manpower. The solution? German prisoners were put to work throughout the American economy. Farmers who contracted for prisoner labor paid the U.S. government 45 cents per hour per laborer, a rate that helped offset the millions of dollars required to maintain the prison camp system. The prisoners themselves received 80 cents per day, providing them with spending money for canteen purchases. Even the nominal compensation exceeded what many prisoners had earned before the war. The work assignments exposed prisoners to aspects of American life that camps alone could not reveal. Prisoners worked on farms across the Great Plains and Midwest, harvesting wheat, picking asparagus, tending livestock. They worked at canneries and mills, processing agricultural products. They worked on construction projects, building roads, repairing infrastructure, even constructing new barracks at the camps where they themselves were housed. These work assignments brought prisoners into direct contact with American civilians. Guards often accompanied work details, but the interaction between prisoners and American farmers, factory managers, and ordinary citizens provided opportunities for cultural exchange that would prove significant. Many American employers found German prisoners to be good workers, disciplined, efficient, skilled. Some prisoners had been farmers before the war and brought agricultural expertise. Others had trade skills, carpentry, metalwork, machinery repair that made them valuable workers. The prisoners took pride in their work, viewing competent performance as maintaining German dignity, even in captivity. The work assignments also provided prisoners with additional perspective on American abundance. They saw American farms with modern equipment, tractors, combines, mechanized harvesters, operating at scales German farms could not match. They saw the quantity of food being produced, wheat fields stretching to the horizon, orchards laden with fruit, livestock raised in numbers German farmers could only imagine. They understood, perhaps for the first time, that American agricultural capacity exceeded anything Germany could achieve. They saw American factories operating with electrical power, modern machinery, efficient production systems. They saw supply chains that functioned despite the demands of global war. They saw material abundance at every level of American society, not just in the prison camps, but throughout the American economy. Some prisoners established personal relationships with their American employers. Farmers invited prisoner work details to share meals. Factory managers learned prisoners' names and treated them as individuals rather than anonymous enemies. Small kindnesses, a cold drink on a hot day, a word of encouragement, recognition of good work, humanized the enemy in ways propaganda could not erase. The Luechen family in Wisconsin established what one family member later described as a lively letter exchange with German prisoners who worked on their farm during the war. After the war ended and prisoners were repatriated, the Luechens sent food and clothing to their former workers in Germany. Eventually they visited some of them in Germany, maintaining friendships that had begun between captors and captives, between enemies who had learned to see each other as human beings. These personal connections, multiplied across thousands of work assignments throughout the United States, created relationships that transcended the categories of friend and enemy that war demanded. Not all German prisoners embraced their transformation. Within the camps, ideological tensions divided prisoners between ardent Nazis, who maintained their political commitments, and those who questioned or rejected Nazi ideology. These tensions sometimes turned violent. Hardcore Nazis, often officers or senior enlisted men who had held positions of authority in Wehrmacht units, attempted to maintain their control over fellow prisoners. They enforced Nazi salutes. They conducted indoctrination sessions. They held kangaroo courts to judge prisoners accused of being anti-Nazi. In some cases, these internal power struggles led to executions, German prisoners murdering other German prisoners for ideological reasons within American prison camps. American camp administrators found themselves navigating complex internal politics. In some cases, administrators chose to allow Nazi-oriented prisoners to control camp affairs because they maintained order more effectively than fractious groups of anti-Nazi prisoners. This decision enabled hardcore Nazis to intimidate and suppress prisoners who questioned Nazi ideology. The War Department eventually recognized this problem and implemented a reeducation program, beginning in 1944. The program sought to teach democratic values, expose prisoners to uncensored information about Nazi crimes, and prepare them for return to post-war Germany. The program included newspapers, books, films, lectures, and discussion groups designed to challenge Nazi ideology and promote democratic thinking. The re-education program's effectiveness remains debated by historians. Formal programs began late in the war and reached only a fraction of prisoners in depth. But Arnold Kramer, the leading historian of German prisoners in America, argues that the informal re-education, the daily experience of American abundance, the fair treatment, the exposure to democratic society accomplished more than formal programs could achieve. The real re-education happened at the canteen when a prisoner bought his first Coca-Cola, Kramer observed. It happened at mealtimes when prisoners ate food better than they'd had in the Wehrmacht. It happened on work details when American farmers treated them with basic human decency. The formal programs may have provided vocabulary and concepts, but the lived experience provided the conviction. The most powerful evidence supporting this thesis: several thousand German prisoners, after returning to Germany and experiencing the devastation of post-war occupation, attempted to immigrate back to the United States. They wanted to return to the nation that had held them as prisoners because the treatment they received as enemies exceeded what they experienced as citizens in their own country. Some succeeded. Hans Weicker, captured in North Africa and held at various camps, including Fort Robinson in Nebraska, eventually became an American citizen and retired as a physician in Georgetown, Maine. Decades after the war, he reflected, "Our treatment was excellent. The food was excellent and clothing adequate. Many POWs complained about being POWs. No girlfriends, no contact with family. But compared to what we'd known, it was a golden cage." The experiences of German prisoners in America stood in stark contrast to the treatment of American prisoners held by Germany. While German prisoners in America gained weight, played sports, and ate ice cream, American prisoners in German camps survived on inadequate rations supplemented by Red Cross packages. While German prisoners worked for wages and bought chocolate bars, American prisoners endured harsh conditions, limited medical care, and constant hunger. A 1944 U.S. military report on the treatment of American prisoners in Germany concluded that while Germany generally adhered to Geneva Convention protocols, food rations were insufficient to maintain life in a normally active person. American prisoners survived largely on Red Cross food parcels. When those parcels arrived irregularly or stopped entirely, prisoners faced starvation. The disparity was not lost on either the prisoners or their guards. German prisoners in America understood they were receiving treatment far better than American prisoners in Germany were receiving. This knowledge created complicated feelings, gratitude mixed with guilt, relief mixed with shame. American camp administrators occasionally reminded German prisoners of this disparity. When prisoners complained about conditions or made demands, administrators would point out that American prisoners in Germany would consider themselves fortunate to receive what German prisoners in America took for granted. The message was clear. America was treating German prisoners better than Germany treated American prisoners. This asymmetry reinforced the lesson about American values and material abundance. America could afford to be generous even to its enemies. Germany, despite its claims of superiority, could barely feed its own citizens, much less treat prisoners humanely. The peak of German prisoner population in the United States occurred in mid-1945, with approximately 400,000 prisoners detained in camps across the country. This number included not only German Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe soldiers, but also members of the Waffen-SS and other Nazi organizations. The diversity of prisoners from conscripts who had served reluctantly to committed Nazis who maintained their ideological fervor created complex dynamics within camps. The end of the war in Europe on May 8, 1945, did not lead to immediate repatriation. Prisoners remained in American custody while the War Department worked out logistics for returning hundreds of thousands of men to a devastated Germany. The occupation zones were still being organized. Housing for repatriated prisoners did not exist. Food supplies in Germany were inadequate to sustain the existing civilian population, much less absorb hundreds of thousands of returning soldiers. The delay in repatriation meant prisoners spent months, sometimes more than a year, in American camps after the war ended. During this period, they learned about conditions in post-war Germany. Letters from families described destroyed cities, collapsed infrastructure, food shortages reaching crisis levels, occupation by Allied forces, and the revelation of Nazi crimes at concentration camps and death camps. The contrast between their comfortable captivity and the devastation in Germany intensified the cognitive dissonance prisoners experienced. They were living better as prisoners in America than their families were living in defeated Germany. The golden cage remained golden even after the war ended. When repatriation finally began in 1946, prisoners returned to a Germany that shocked them. Cities lay in ruins, food was scarce, housing was inadequate. The occupation forces American, British, French, Soviet controlled all aspects of German life. The Nazi state that had promised German superiority and final victory had delivered total defeat and national humiliation. For many repatriated prisoners, the memory of their treatment in America became a standard against which they measured post-war German conditions. Some prisoners, particularly those held in the American occupation zone, found themselves receiving better treatment from American occupation forces than they received as German civilians under German authority. The experience of captivity in America had lasting effects on many prisoners. They had seen firsthand that Nazi propaganda about American weakness was false. They had experienced democratic society, even as prisoners, and found it preferable to the totalitarian system they had known. They had learned that abundance and generosity were not signs of weakness, but expressions of strength. They had discovered that America's material plenty was not decadence, but the product of industrial capacity, agricultural productivity, and economic systems that Germany could not match. The story of German prisoners in America raises profound questions about the nature of ideological transformation and the power of lived experience to challenge propaganda. Nazi ideology had taught these men that Germany was superior, that Americans were weak and decadent, that German systems and German values represented the pinnacle of civilization. Yet the direct experience of American abundance, the ice cream, the Coca-Cola, the chocolate bars, the casual waste of resources, the fair treatment, the material plenty at every level systematically demolished these beliefs. Arnold Kramer's definitive history, Nazi Prisoners of War in America, documents how nearly 500,000 prisoners spent time in 511 camps across the United States between 1942 and 1946. His research, based on military archives, Red Cross reports, prisoner testimonies, and interviews with survivors, reveals a consistent pattern. Prisoners arrived expecting brutality and found abundance. They anticipated starvation and encountered ice cream. They feared their captors and discovered fair treatment. The US government's decision to treat German prisoners humanely was not primarily motivated by humanitarian concerns. Geneva Convention protocols required it, but more importantly, American officials recognized that humane treatment of German prisoners would encourage similar treatment of American prisoners held by Germany. The policy was pragmatic: improve conditions for your own prisoners by treating enemy prisoners well. But the policy had unintended consequences that exceeded its diplomatic objectives. The humane treatment, combined with the overwhelming material abundance prisoners experienced, achieved ideological transformation that formal re-education programs could not match. The prisoners returned to Germany not just with memories of adequate food and fair treatment, but with fundamentally altered worldviews about American society and German propaganda. The statistical evidence supports this conclusion. Of the approximately 400,000 German prisoners held in America, fewer than 1%, only 2,222 prisoners attempted to escape. This extraordinarily low escape rate suggests prisoners recognized their captivity was preferable to the alternatives. Many prisoners actively resisted repatriation, seeking ways to remain in the United States or return after being sent back to Germany. The low death rate among prisoners provides additional evidence. Approximately 56,000 deaths occurred among all German prisoners held by all Allied forces, excluding the Soviet Union, representing approximately 1% mortality. For prisoners held specifically in the United States, the death rate was even lower. This compares favorably to death rates in German prison camps and contrasts dramatically with the nearly 50% mortality rate among American prisoners held by Japan. These statistics reveal that American policy succeeded not just in maintaining Geneva Convention standards, but in creating conditions where prisoners thrived physically, while experiencing cognitive transformation psychologically. Individual stories illustrate the broader patterns. Fritz Enslin served as a tank gunner in an armored regiment before his capture and transport to Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, in 1943. He described his fear of captivity. "I was afraid of the treatment I might receive as a POW." His fear was based on Nazi propaganda that warned of American brutality toward prisoners. His actual experience contradicted every warning. "The food was better than I'd eaten in the Wehrmacht. The Americans treated us fairly. We could play sports, attend classes, work for wages. I gained 15 pounds in 6 months." When asked decades later about his most vivid memory of captivity, Enslin mentioned ice cream specifically. "Ice cream every day if you wanted it." In Germany, ice cream was a luxury even before the war. In an American prison camp, it was routine. That told me everything about which nation would win the war. Obergefreiter Klaus Huber, captured in France and held at Camp Concordia in Kansas, wrote letters to his family describing conditions that his mother initially believed were lies designed to deceive censors. "When I wrote that we could buy Coca-Cola for 5 cents and chocolate bars for 10 cents, my mother wrote back asking why I was lying. She thought the American censors would only allow letters that made America look good. When I sent her a Hershey bar in a package, she finally believed me. Then she cried because her son, a prisoner of war, had access to chocolate she could not buy at any price in Germany." Feldwebel Ernst Zimmermann recalled the moment his worldview shifted. "It was Thanksgiving, 1944. The Americans prepared a special meal: turkey, stuffing, potatoes, vegetables, pies, everything. They served German prisoners the same meal American soldiers received. I sat there eating more food than I'd seen in months, and I thought about my family in Dresden eating their ration of bread and potatoes. I realized that America was so wealthy it could afford to give banquet meals to its enemies. Nazi propaganda had called Americans decadent and weak, but only a strong nation can afford such generosity." These individual testimonies, repeated across thousands of prisoners held at hundreds of camps throughout the United States, reveal a consistent pattern of ideological transformation achieved through direct experience of American abundance. The historical significance of the German prisoner experience in America extends beyond World War II. The policy of humane treatment, the material abundance prisoners experienced, and the ideological transformation many prisoners underwent established precedents that influenced American military doctrine in subsequent conflicts. The Korean War saw application of similar principles, though with less success given different cultural contexts and different enemy ideology. The Vietnam War raised questions about treatment of prisoners that referenced World War II precedents. Even current debates about detention policies and treatment of captured enemies invoke comparisons to the German prisoner experience. But perhaps the most lasting legacy is the lesson about soft power, the ability to influence others through attraction rather than coercion. The German prisoners who returned to Germany carrying memories of ice cream and Coca-Cola, who remembered fair treatment and material abundance, who maintained friendships with American families they had worked for during captivity, became informal ambassadors for American values in post-war Germany. These men helped rebuild West Germany with positive associations toward the United States. They remembered that America had treated them humanely when they were enemies. They recalled American generosity even in wartime. They understood that democratic capitalism had produced the abundance they experienced. When the United States implemented the Marshall Plan to rebuild Western Europe, including West Germany, these former prisoners were predisposed to support American involvement because they had seen American generosity firsthand. The contrast with Soviet treatment of German prisoners provides instructive comparison. Approximately 3 million German prisoners were held by the Soviet Union during and after World War II. Of these, approximately 1 million died in captivity from starvation, disease, exposure, and harsh treatment. German prisoners in Soviet camps experienced conditions far worse than German civilians experienced during the war. Many prisoners were not released until years after the war ended, with the last prisoners returning to Germany in 1956. German prisoners who survived Soviet captivity returned with horror stories of brutality, starvation, and inhumane treatment. They became ardently anti-communist and anti-Soviet. Their experiences shaped West German attitudes toward the Soviet Union and communism for generations. The ideological effects of prisoner treatment, American humane treatment creating positive associations, Soviet brutal treatment creating negative associations, illustrate how direct experience shapes worldviews more powerfully than propaganda or formal education programs ever could. The economic dimensions of the prisoner program reveal additional aspects of American abundance. The United States spent millions of dollars constructing camps, feeding prisoners, providing medical care, paying wages, and maintaining security for nearly 500,000 prisoners over 4 years. This expenditure, while significant, represented a tiny fraction of American wartime spending. By 1944, the United States was spending approximately $250 million annually on the prisoner program. To put this in context, the United States spent more than $300 billion on World War II overall. The prisoner program represented less than 0.1% of total war expenditures. America could afford to treat prisoners generously because the cost, while substantial in absolute terms, was trivial relative to total wartime spending. This economic reality underscores the lesson prisoners learned. America's material abundance was so vast that even generous treatment of hundreds of thousands of enemy prisoners barely registered as a budgetary concern. Germany, by contrast, struggled to feed its own population while fighting a multi-front war. The economic disparity between the two nations, revealed through the prisoner experience, demonstrated conclusively that German propaganda about economic superiority was false. The labor performed by prisoners provided partial offset to the cost of the program. Farmers and manufacturers paid the government for prisoner labor, generating revenue that reduced net program costs. But more importantly, prisoner labor helped address wartime labor shortages that threatened agricultural production and war industry output. The economic benefit of prisoner labor, while difficult to quantify precisely, contributed significantly to American wartime economic capacity. The cultural dimensions of the prisoner experience reveal additional complexities. German prisoners brought with them cultural traditions, values, and practices that sometimes conflicted with American norms. Camp administrators had to navigate cultural differences while maintaining security and order. German military culture emphasized hierarchy, discipline, and formal relationships. American culture, even in military contexts, was more egalitarian and informal. These cultural differences created friction in some camps, particularly when American guards treated high-ranking German officers with less deference than those officers expected based on Wehrmacht traditions. Some German prisoners found American informality disturbing. The casualness with which American soldiers addressed officers, the lack of rigid formality in daily interactions, the tendency toward democratic decision-making rather than top-down command, all of this conflicted with German military culture. Some prisoners interpreted American informality as weakness or lack of discipline, but other prisoners found American culture liberating. The relative equality between officers and enlisted men, the opportunities for individual expression, the acceptance of diverse viewpoints, the emphasis on merit rather than birth or connections. These aspects of American culture appealed to prisoners who had chafed under rigid German hierarchies. The cultural exchange went both ways. American guards and administrators learned about German culture through daily interaction with prisoners. They discovered that German soldiers were not uniformly Nazi fanatics, but individuals with varied beliefs and motivations. They learned to distinguish between committed Nazis who maintained ideological fervor and ordinary soldiers who had served reluctantly or who had never embraced Nazi ideology. These personal interactions humanized the enemy in ways that propaganda could not. American guards who played cards with prisoners, who shared jokes and conversation, who worked alongside prisoners on labor details, found it difficult to maintain hatred for enemy soldiers, who seemed fundamentally similar to American soldiers, young men far from home, following orders, trying to survive. The repatriation process, when it finally began in earnest in 1946, tested the transformation prisoners had undergone. After months or years in American custody, prisoners returned to a Germany that bore little resemblance to the nation they had left. Cities were destroyed. The economy had collapsed. Occupation forces controlled daily life. The Nazi state that had sent them to war no longer existed. For many prisoners, the return was traumatic. They had adapted to abundance in American camps. They had grown accustomed to adequate food, comfortable housing, recreational activities, and fair treatment. Now, they returned to devastation, hunger, and uncertainty. The care packages some prisoners received from American families they had worked for during captivity provided lifelines during the difficult post-war years. The Luetchen family in Wisconsin, mentioned earlier, sent food and clothing to former prisoners. Other American families established similar relationships. These gestures of generosity from former captors to former prisoners demonstrated the personal bonds that had formed during captivity. Some repatriated prisoners maintained correspondence with Americans they had known during captivity. These letters, exchanged over years and decades, reveal lasting friendships that transcended the categories of enemy and ally that war had imposed. Former prisoners invited American friends to visit Germany. Some American families made the journey, renewing friendships that had begun under the unusual circumstances of captivity. The number of former prisoners who eventually immigrated to the United States, estimates range from several hundred to several thousand, provides quantitative evidence of successful ideological transformation. These men chose to leave Germany permanently and settle in the nation that had held them as prisoners, because they had learned during captivity that America offered opportunities and freedoms Germany could not match. In 1984, 40 years after his capture and captivity at Fort Lewis, Günter Gräwe sat down to write a letter to Marie McCaffrey, co-founder of History Link. In it, he recounted the moment that had stayed with him across 4 decades, standing before the canteen, choosing between ice cream and Coca-Cola, buying both, and realizing in that instant how fortunate he had been. I suddenly realized how extremely lucky I had been to be captured by the American army and not the Russian one, he wrote. The comparison was apt. German prisoners held by the Soviet Union experienced brutal treatment, starvation, and death in shocking numbers. Günter's luck in being captured by Americans rather than Soviets quite literally saved his life. In 2016, at age 91, Günter returned to what is now Joint Base Lewis McChord. He rode his bicycle from the Liberty Gate on Lewis, Maine, to the site of his former prisoner of war camp, escorted by military police. He toured the few remaining barracks structures from the original camp, pointing to the corner where his bed had been. He met with Colonel William Percival, deputy garrison commander, and thanked him, thanked the United States Army, thanked America for the treatment he received as a 19-year-old prisoner more than 70 years earlier. With all the trouble in the Middle East, there are so many things happening, he said during the visit. I think of the prisoners of ISIS. They won't get ice cream or Coca-Cola. My stay here was the best treatment I've had. Günter's journey from teenage Wehrmacht soldier to elderly man cycling across an American military base to express gratitude for his captivity encapsulates the extraordinary story of German prisoners in America during World War II. It illustrates how material abundance, fair treatment, and simple human decency can achieve ideological transformation more effectively than any propaganda campaign. The ice cream and Coca-Cola were never just food and drink. They were symbols of American abundance. They were evidence that Nazi propaganda had lied systematically about American weakness. They were daily reminders that the ideological foundations of Nazi Germany, the claims of German superiority, the promises of final victory, the assertions that Germany represented the apex of civilization, were demonstrably false. When German prisoners stood in camp canteens buying ice cream for a nickel, drinking Coca-Cola freely, eating chocolate bars their own children had never tasted, they were experiencing a truth that demolished Nazi ideology more effectively than any battlefield defeat. America was so prosperous, so materially abundant, that it could afford to treat its enemies better than Germany treated its own citizens. This truth, multiplied across hundreds of thousands of prisoners held at hundreds of camps throughout the United States over 4 years, created an ideological victory that complemented military victory. German soldiers returned home carrying memories not just of defeat, but of discovery, the discovery that the world they had been promised by Nazi propaganda was a lie, and that the enemy they had been taught to despise had treated them with unexpected generosity. In the long contest between totalitarianism and democracy, between scarcity and abundance, between propaganda and lived experience, the German prisoners learned an unforgettable lesson. They learned it one ice cream cone at a time, one bottle of Coca-Cola at a time, one chocolate bar at a time. They learned it through the casual abundance of an American prison camp, where the casual waste of food could have fed German villages for months. They learned that democratic capitalism had produced prosperity that authoritarian systems could never match. They learned that American values, even extended to enemies in wartime, created societies where even prisoners could thrive. They learned that the golden cage of American captivity was golden not just because of the material abundance within, but because of what that abundance revealed about the society that produced it. And they carried these lessons back to Germany, where they would help build a new nation aligned with the democratic West, grateful to the former enemy that had defeated them in battle, but had treated them with unexpected humanity in captivity.